everybody and welcome. Sorry for the whiplash. We're going back to back on the Enchant Merc Sorceress. So if you haven't seen my original video, there's a link to it right there for you. You can check it out. The too long didn't watch rendition of it is we enchant ourselves and our mercenary. We have an explosive arrow mercenary. She applies that big enchant damage to the explosion, and we basically support her with static and teleporting while she destroys monsters even on player's aid settings. If you have then seen my second video, which is located right here, we've discovered that sadly one facet of the game actually hasn't been fixed, and a known bug from LOD is still persisting. The fire explosive arrows or bolts proc from Kuko Shikaku actually doesn't work on the mercenary, and again I'll show you the proof in the video that I just posted, but the too long didn't watch of that is we put on a heavily modded Ravenclaw with like a level 127 explosive arrow, and when we shoot it we kill monsters in one hit. When the mercenary shoots it, she just does her base arrow damage, so she doesn't actually get the benefit of the explosive arrow. Now, what that means is the video and the build that you saw yesterday, or today if you just watch it, was even stronger than we thought it was, because 1/3 of the time she was just firing normal arrows as opposed to double dipping on explosion arrows. Now, what does that mean for us? Here, one, we've built out the Sorceress in a better way that actually brings more utility, more damage, and better clear speed. And then on top of that, our mercenary is about 1.5 times stronger than she was yesterday, because if we're not using Kuko Shikaku, we can use a much stronger helmet and a much stronger bow. Being able to put a mist rune word on our mercenary, one, gets her 1 frame faster attack rate, so she's at the 9 frame attack rate right now, gets her +3 to all skills. It also gets her 100% pierce, and then on top of that, big damage, freeze, target, additional cold damage, and all resistances, which means she's even tankier before treachery procs. But that 100% pierce means we no longer have to use wisdom on her helmet. And while I looked at a lot of different bow combinations, different armors, and different helmets, what it comes down to is 2 options really for the helmet slot. For max damage, as well as being able to increase your damage against monsters whose fire immunity is just barely broken by conviction, we have Flickering Flame. Not only does it give us additional survivability with that resist fire aura, the +3 fire skills is going to go a long way to buff out her native exploding arrow and fire arrow, but that -15 enemy res means in a lot of scenarios where she used to only be doing 2 to 7% of her total damage, she's now getting 17 to 22% of her total fire damage. And then on top of that, this concentration aura on mist means that she's added about 1,000 physical damage onto her build as well. You'll see with just the enchant up and the base damage from her attack, she's now sitting at 5,000 to 6,700 damage on her regular arrow, and then her explosive arrow is maxing out at 1,400. Add on top of that our 5,500 damage from enchant, and that means that her exploding arrows are doing close to 7k fire damage. And keep in mind that also applies to her normal arrow attacks and to her fire arrow attacks as well. But what about the Sorceress herself? What's different from yesterday? If you didn't watch the video, we basically had Thunderstorm and Static as additional damage, and then we were using Glacial Spike for a little bit of CC, but everything else was being done by the Mercenary. So we've changed out one item on the build itself. We're now prioritizing the Stone of Jordan for that additional increased maximum mana, as well as flat mana, which gets buffed by our bow. We used to be using a BK, but that only gives a life based off of level, and that doesn't get hit by your bow. Thank you for the correction in the comments, by the way. But on top of that, we've drastically swapped out our skill tree. For the enchant art itself, we're still going with max warmth, max enchant, and then max fire mastery. And when we have all of our full fire kit on, this is bumping up to about 5,500 fire damage. The big change though comes in the lightning tree. We're only picking up frozen armor from cold spells, so we're no longer going down into glacial spike or cold mastery. We're still only getting 1 point telekinesis and teleport. A lot of people were asking about energy shield, and 1 point telekinesis and 1 point energy shield means you're still taking almost double the damage to your mana, and it wasn't really sustainable even with going in on max energy. We would need to put a lot more points into telekinesis, and that takes away from the biggest change, which is we're now basically a Nova Sorceress. So we still go 1 point down into Thunderstorm, 1 point down into Lightning Mastery, and then enough points in Static Field that when we have our battle commands up, we're at that 22, we're actually at 24. We're at the minimum of 22 yard radius, which hits the entirety of the screen from corner to corner. And then the rest of our points are going down into Nova. Now, why is this so important? Nova itself doing 2,000 to 2,800 damage doesn't sound like a lot on players 8, but you have to remember, we are running Infinity, and our Infinity has minus 49 enemy res. On top of that, we have minus 10 res from the Crown of Ages. So altogether, this being basically minus 60 on top of Conviction Aura, we have minus 144 enemy light res. So any monster that isn't naturally immune to lightning to start off with is basically taking double full damage. So our Nova, only doing 2,400 damage, is actually doing closer to 4,000 to 5,000 damage, depending on the monster that we're attacking. What about the gameplay that you've been watching? Well, we have bumped down to players 5, so keep that in mind. This is on players 5 difficulty for everything. While you can farm on players 8, and we showed that yesterday with worse gear and a worse setup, it's just very unrealistic, especially on multiplayer where most people can't fill out a players 8 game. So I wanted to give people a closer idea of what it might look like in a pub game, or if you're just trying to efficiently farm on single player. The places where we really suffered were on boss kill speed, anything that had pure fire immunes that weren't broken with conviction, and areas where our mercenary was getting ganged up by on a lot of monsters. So this could happen in cows, this could happen in places like the Worldstone Keep, and in other areas. Like bringing Nova onto the build means that we are actually committing a lot more damage to the field as opposed to just the mercenaries damage. And on top of that, Nova's going to be putting monsters into hit recovery fairly often. So that's going to give her that survivability and area to move that she was getting out of Glacial Spike Frost Nova, but is adding on close to 5k lightning damage per second at the 63 FCR breakpoint. On top of that, in areas where there were pure fire immunes, especially like Lister in the throne room, now as you can see from the gameplay that you're watching, we could just sit there tanking, face tank with Nova while our mercenary is still dumping a ton of physical damage in from the back ranks. And all of a sudden, where we had to pull them out previously, now we're able to down them in the throne room. Our Infinity with our Enchant is boasting an impressive 17 to 21,000 damage along with Crushing Blow. It's really useful on people like Indariel and Mephisto. The build is dumping out a lot more damage per second, has a much better control of the area around it, is a lot more involved, so it's more fun to play in this regard as opposed to before where you're just kind of hitting telekinesis on fire immune monsters until your merc killed them with physical damage. And then on top of that, the concentration aura, the 100% pierce, the better plus to skills means that this mercenary is now just doing more damage than it was before. So her overall survivability and viability in all the same farming spots has just increased. Again, I'd say by about 1.5 times the total power output, even though that's kind of difficult to quantify. What we're using is an Ashudas with an additional fire facet in it, an Enchant Ormus Robe with an additional fire facet in it, Flickering Flame for the +3 to fire skills here. You could actually also get a +3 to fire skills with multiple sockets, put facets in that as well. Again, this is just the easiest way for me to get the plus skills that we wanted. A ridiculous amulet here, you actually don't need a 220, and again, you could actually use a 3 to fire skills 10 FCR amulet, but I do like the Sorceress skill since we're going to be using this also on our mercenary support swap, so it's nice to have the stats there. Obviously a spirit, any boots will do, but any skill rings, arachnid mesh, mage fist for the +1 to fire skills, as well as the faster cast rate, an entire inventory of fire skillers to start, along with an Annie and a torch, as well as life all res here. You actually don't need this much life and this much all res. This is what we're using for the maximum enchant bonus. Obviously we have a call to arms on swap for that additional +1 skill, and we're going to be recasting battle orders as often as we need to keep our life and the mercenary's life up. By using a Crown of Ages, which we have 2 light facets in, we are using a Chains of Honor for additional all res, additional to our skills, as well as that damage reduction. And then we need to swap out a single ring for this FCR breakpoint. We're going to be teleporting around at the 63 breakpoint. So with just Arachnid Mesh, Mage Fist, and a 220 amulet, it's not enough. So you need to drop onto 1 ring here. So there you have it. I definitely think that this might be the best version of the Enchant Merc Sorceress, or the Smirk Sorceress, whatever you want to call it. Somebody in chat coined that. Shoutouts to Grinning Hazard. But the Enchant Smirk build is just so much fun to play, so much better as this Nova variant, And I'll just say very quickly, there are two other pretty viable variants that really depend on where you're trying to farm. Since we max out warmth, there are two skills that are actually useful that benefit from a synergy with warmth. The first one is Blaze. Blaze with a full synergized warmth is doing something like 12k fire damage per second on the ground. And I noticed that using this in places like cows, where I would teleport into an area, run in a quick circle, and then drag the cows through it while teleporting backwards, means that my mercenary was constantly firing. And we basically doubled the total DPS that we were able to put out, because those cows very slowly walking through the blaze were taking a ton of damage. The problem with it is that Blaze is a little clunky to use, and you feel more incentivized to use the Blaze than just reposition the mercenary. So you're losing a lot of DPS on her most of the time, and it requires a lot of min-maxing to get this right. The second skill is Firewall. Firewall gets its biggest bonus from warmth, and oddly enough, again with a maxed out synergy, Firewall is doing about 12,000 damage per second as well. The thing with Firewall is it hits a much bigger area, but it's harder to manipulate in which direction it's going to happen, since you have to keep in mind you're moving your mercenary constantly, you're moving out of the way of monsters, you're trying to static, but you want to have Firewall down. It became a bit too consuming to figure out how to actually maximize Firewall, but I will say against bosses, especially on players 8, being able to drop 2 or 3 Firewalls doing 36,000 damage per second on a boss that has minus 85 enemy fire res puts out a ton of kill speed. Bosses like Endariel, Mephisto, and even Bale die a lot faster using the Firewall strategy, but having to invest so much into this means you're basically a one element or one trick pony. And I noticed that because we want to be able to farm a lot of different areas, losing out on all of the lightning damage drastically hindered our ability to be successful. So unless you only want to farm bosses or only want to farm cows, the pure fire tree version of this build isn't the best one out there, but it is definitely overperforming in those two scenarios. So there you have it. I think that this puts a final chapter on my experimentation with the Enchant Smirk build that we have here. Your mercenary puts out a ton of damage. It's so fun using any other mercenary than an Act 2 Infinity, and it's just such an awesome way to play the game. I felt like I was very much aware of just so much more of the battlefield, what was going on, what monsters had already been staticked, who I needed to prioritize damage on. It was just very, very involved and a lot of fun and very challenging. And then on top of that, you just see like ridiculous clear speed coming out of an Act 1 mercenary, which I am super refreshed to see. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I'm glad to have been able to test and clear up the idea about how Kuko works, or any, replacement effects on fire's exploding arrows, fire magic arrows, etc., etc. And I'd love to know what you think. Is this the final version of this build? Do you think that I've tried out everything that's worthwhile to test on it? If not, let me know down in the comments. A lot of people gave a lot of amazing suggestions on my video that I posted yesterday, and it helped to both reimagine what the build should look like and get better results out of our testing, and also to prioritize better stats, etc. So I always love hearing more from the community and what you all think, because I'm not the only person playing this game. I know a lot of people have a lot of great experience with it, so I'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.